Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's event where we'll be launching the V3 Plus framework. My name is Jessie Backer. I am here at Dime, and I had the pleasure of leading the V3 Plus project. You will be hearing from several other people during today's event, and I will introduce them as we go. So during the first part of today's event, I'm going to talk you through the V3 Plus framework and what it's all about. That will then lead us into a panel discussion looking at implementation of V3 Plus. And finally, we'll conclude today's event with a fireside chat welcoming our colleagues from FDA to share their regulatory perspectives. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. So as always, today's session is being recorded, and the slides and the recording will be available on Dime's webinar page later today. So look out for an announcement on that. To ask a question, please do use the chat box in Zoom. We will endeavor to respond within this hour, but if we don't, we'll be sure to follow up with you as needed with further info. And as a quick reminder, participants are not permitted to transcribe the webinar, please. Okay, so for those new to our community, Dime is a global nonprofit dedicated to advancing the ethical, effective, equitable, and safe use of digital medicine to redefine healthcare and improve lives. We launched in May of 2019, and we sit at the intersection of the healthcare and technology communities. Now, much of our work is done within pre-competitive collaborations. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our V3 Plus project partners, Ardex, Actigraph, Atcore, Exponent, Genentech, Global Kinetics, J&J, Regeneron, Sage Therapeutics, Stell Life, Sysnav, and TNO. We also had a number of individual subject matter experts joining us from Cleveland Clinic Children's, the Intelligent Futures Research Lab at Nationwide Children's Hospital, and several of my colleagues here at Dime. And finally, the entire collaboration took place within DataCC, which is a collaborative community hosted by Dime within the FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health. I had the pleasure of working alongside 51 external collaborators as part of this project. I counted them today. I can't thank everyone individually, but your work is very much appreciated. So the original V3 framework, which many of you will be familiar with, has become foundational to the way that we evaluate sensor-based digital health technologies as being fit for purpose. But the adoption of these tools, as I'm sure this audience is very well aware, has grown enormously in recent years in both research and in clinical care settings. And the use of these products at much larger scale has drawn attention to various challenges related to accessibility and usability. So our objective within this project was to build on the success of V3 by adding an evidence-based component addressing human-centered design, human factors, and usability. But before we dive in, let's define the technologies that are in scope. So sensor-based digital health technologies, exactly as the name suggests, rely on a combination of sensors and algorithms to generate digital clinical measures. They are mobile, meaning that they are capable of collecting data outside of traditional clinical lab settings, and they are connected. So broadly speaking, these might be wearables, implantable tools, ingestible tools, or what we refer to as ambient tools, meaning those that are not worn on the body or in the body, such as connected weight scales, smart medication packaging, cameras, microphones placed in the environment, that kind of thing. So it's a fairly broad scope. And as a quick refresher, the original V3 framework was published in 2020, and it includes 3 components. The first is verification, which evaluates the performance of each sensor contained within the product itself. Analytical validation, which evaluates the performance of the algorithm, and clinical validation, which evaluates the clinical meaningfulness of the digital measure generated by the technology. So that is the extent to which the digital measure acceptably identifies, measures, or predicts a meaningful clinical state or experience in a stated context of use. So as we set out to extend the V3 framework to address usability and related concepts, we undertook as a team a series of preliminary activities. And the first of those was a landscape analysis. And that led to the development of DataCC's Library of Human Factors Resources, which compiles and indexes various regulatory guidance and industry standards related to design and usability that are applicable to digital health technologies. So I do encourage you all to visit the library and check it out if you haven't already, or even if you have, because true to the spirit of a living resource that will be maintained over time, the library has just been expanded this week to include 2 more industry standards. So it will continue to grow and expand over time. Next, we conducted a systematic scoping review looking at 10 years of literature, evaluating the design and usability of sensor-based digital health technologies. Within that review, we identified 83 studies, which collectively looked at 164 different technologies. And again, I do encourage you to check out the manuscript, which is available as a preprint at the moment while it's under review. And what we found, as indicated by the figure on the right, was substantial heterogeneity in not only the study design, but also the methodology, the ways that data were captured, and the study outcomes that were used to evaluate usability of these sensor-based digital technologies. So the library of regulatory guidance and industry standards, along with this systematic review, gave us, as a team, a nice top-down and bottom-up understanding of the landscape. And that's what we relied on to ensure that as we added and developed the new usability validation component of V3+, it was evidence-driven throughout. So here it is, the unveiling. So as you can see, usability validation evaluates the extent to which a sensor-based digital health technology can be used to achieve specified goals with ease, efficiency, and user satisfaction. And over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through the 5 key activities that comprise usability validation. So let's do it. For sensor-based DHTs that are under development, so these might be completely novel technology that's new to the market, or it might be a next generation version of an existing technology. The entire V3+ process begins with development of a proposed intended use statement. Now, obviously, that is a term that is applied to regulated medical devices, but the types of questions covered within the intended use are really critical to all of the processes that follow. So we do recommend that a similar statement or an equivalent be developed or considered for, say, general wellness products or those types of technologies that are developed primarily for either consumer use or other uses other than being regulated medical devices. So things like, what does the technology do? Who are the intended users? Where, when, and how should the technology be used? And that intended use statement then has a direct impact on the technical specification, which is out of scope for today, and the use specification, which is the first of 5 activities for usability validation. The use specification is a living document, meaning that it does require maintenance and updates over time. And it contains detailed descriptions of all of the various user groups, all intended use environments, and all aspects of the digital health technology user interface. So this document is really the counterpart to the technical specification, which describes the technology itself in more depth. And the use specification describes all of the very specific characteristics of not only the end users, so the patients or study participants of interest, but also any other groups who would interact with the product during normal use. So that might include care partners in some circumstances, clinicians, researchers, administrators, anyone else within a professional role, excuse me, who has some kind of role to play during normal use of the product. So the second activity is the use-related risk analysis, which is also a living document. The analysis will include a very thorough description of all user tasks, so it can be fairly lengthy, as well as any potential use errors, use-related hazards, and a plan to either eliminate or minimize all of those known risks. So the optimal approach here, and this is described in industry standards as well as regulatory guidance, is to redesign the product so that the risk is completely removed, so it's entirely avoided. But if that's not possible, protective measures might be the next most appropriate thing. So an example of that for a DHT might be a pop-up warning appearing on a screen. And finally, as a last resort, information and training can be provided that informs users on how to avoid the risk in question. But that's not optimal for obvious reasons, that not everyone reads a user manual. And of course, even those that do probably don't remember everything that they read. So instead, we aim for inherent safety by design, by designing the product in such a way as to avoid potential errors, hazards, and risk. Now, throughout the whole project, we've been very intentional with the terminology that we've used. And one example of that is use error, which is certainly not a term that we came up with. It is used in various places, but it's preferable to user error because it avoids the implication that the user is at fault. And instead, it shifts the focus onto the design of the product and developing it in such a way that avoids those use errors to begin with. So speaking of design, that is the third activity. And we recommend adopting the principles of human-centered design, which focus on the needs of the users that have been defined within the use spec. And it aims to make products that are intuitive, accessible, and enjoyable to use, because good design is a lot more than just minimizing risk and error. So at a very high level, human-centered design is empathetic, it is user-centric and multidisciplinary. It is holistic in that it considers the entire end-to-end user journey rather than only focusing on the DHT hardware, for example. And it's iterative, which allows a gradual step-by-step approach to designing the product, developing prototypes, and then testing the usability of those prototypes, which then allows that information, the new learnings, to go back to the design and improve each prototype in succession. So when we talk about products being not only safe, but also enjoyable, we should also keep in mind that, especially for DHTs, that harm can result not only from hazards related to using the product, but also from missing data. So if a product is poorly designed, engagement and usage of that product is likely to be low. That's an obvious risk to clinical research, for retention in the studies, and also maximizing the data completeness, because any missing data, of course, if depending on the extent, can jeopardize the integrity of the entire trial. But also in clinical care, where missing or unreliable or otherwise issues with the data might lead to false negative test results, for example. It might mean that a clinician misses signs of a deterioration or an event that they might otherwise have been able to intervene on. Or it might lead to, for example, inappropriate treatment-related decisions. So there is a lot more to design than minimizing risk and hazard. And I've referred to this a little bit throughout, but design goes hand in hand with formative evaluation, which is the fourth activity here. So a formative evaluation is any activity or study that evaluates the usability of a prototype, so a product that is under active development. And as indicated by the circular arrow, the relationship is iterative between design and formative evaluation. So each update to the design is tested in a formative evaluation, which then feeds information back to the next design, which requires another evaluation, so on and so forth, as the product improves and becomes more mature. Now, generally speaking, of course, there are different ways of doing it, but early prototypes are oftentimes evaluated with small sample sizes. Oftentimes, they are healthy individuals at first. And as the prototypes become more and more mature, the sample will increasingly represent the intended user populations, as well as the conditions of actual use, being as close as possible to the intended use as described in the statement. We do recommend that for digital health technologies, as soon as is feasible during the development process, evaluate data capture in the intended use environments, so in remote settings without supervision. It's important that that is done as early as possible so that the design is hopefully still in a state that can be easily modified to accommodate any technical errors, any issues with the data transfer, etc. So once the technology has reached a point where the developer believes that it is in its final version, so it's not only sufficiently usable, but it's also gone through, verification, testing of the sensors, analytical validation of the algorithm. They'll then progress to summative evaluation. And that is the fifth and final activity of usability validation. So summative evaluation is a study that's conducted, well, actually, it may be more than one study, but it's studies that are conducted on the final version of the technology. And the goal of these studies is to demonstrate usability amongst a representative sample under conditions reflecting the intended use. So it's as close as possible to real-world implementation conditions. And you can think of summative evaluation as being kind of the equivalent of the final analytical validation study that evaluates algorithm performance. So, typically during algorithm development, there's a series of preliminary studies or activities while the algorithm is being updated and developed. And then the final version of the algorithm is, I guess, put through its paces in the final analytical validation study. And within usability, that study is the summative evaluation study. So as is the case with analytical validation, the study outcomes and the success criteria, so that the pass-fail decisions must be pre-specified. And I won't take time today to go through, all of the various categories of usability-related outcomes. We do have a description in our manuscript as well as on our website, but two study outcomes that are, I think, particularly important for DHTs are understandability and actionability. So whenever a technology presents data or any other kind of information, so it might be in a user manual, warnings, cautions, etc., anytime there is data or information presented to a user, it's critical that the study assesses the extent to which the user understands that information. And taking that one step further, if the user is then required to act on the information. So, for example, maybe they're a clinician, they're using a portal to examine the data and adjust medication, or maybe for a user, like an end user, maybe they need to review their data and complete a task. Their understanding of those actions and their ability to carry them out should also be assessed in a summative evaluation study. Now, a unique feature of usability evaluations, unlike, for example, analytical validation, is that these studies recruit not only the end users, so the patient population of interest, but also any other user group that will interact with the product. So as I mentioned earlier, care partners, for example, but maybe clinicians, researchers, administrators. It depends on not only the product itself, but also the various elements of the intended use statement. So representatives from those groups would also be recruited into a study, or it might be a series of sub-studies, for example, so that their usability of the product can also be evaluated in addition to the representative patient population. Now, if summative evaluation is successful, then the usability validation component of V3+ is complete at that point. But if it fails, that would prompt the need for a redesign in order to address, whichever component or aspect of the product failed. And that would then require formative evaluation and back to summative evaluation. So there is a negative feedback loop built in there as well. Now, of course, the story doesn't end at that point, as is true for analytical validation, for example. There is always a need for post-market surveillance and lifecycle management, as well as version control and change management over time. So these are the 5 usability validation components of V3+, the 5 that are shown in black. And this complete slide shows the approximate relationship with the original 3 components of V3. So verification, analytical validation, and clinical validation. And of course, the order and the timing of activities is flexible, and it might vary from one case to another. But generally speaking, this is the order and the timing of activities. So everything I have talked through in the last 15 minutes or so is applicable to pre-market sensor-based DHTs. So those are under active development, meaning that the technical specification as well as the design is being adjusted and updated step by step as the prototypes become more and more mature. But V3+, just as was the case with V3, is also applicable to post-market technologies. So For example, a study sponsor or a healthcare provider might be evaluating some different technologies that they're considering adopting in either their study, their clinical trial, or in their clinical practice. And in that scenario, the entire v3+ process instead begins with development of the context of use statement. So the intended use and the context of use statements, they address very similar questions, as you can see on the left-hand side of the slide. But the difference is that the intended use summarizes the technology developer's claims or statements around what the technology does, what it's designed to do, whereas the context of use statement describes the manner in which the technology will be implemented. So the gaps between those two statements, the intended use and the context of use, that will guide the sponsor or the provider, whoever the stakeholder in question is, as they think about whether existing usability data are sufficient to demonstrate fit for purpose or whether further evidence is required. So for example, if there is complete overlap between the intended use and the context of use, the stakeholder might decide that the existing usability data is sufficient for their purposes and they can move straight to implementation. But if there is a gap, so an easy example is a product developed initially for adults that is now considered being applied for data collection amongst children, for example, then further evidence will be required. And in that case, the use specification and the risk analysis should proceed in exactly the same way as I just described a few moments ago. But after that, we move straight to summative evaluation. So there's no immediate opportunity in this scenario to modify the design. And of course, the technical specs, there are no prototypes, so formative evaluation is also out of scope. Now, of course, version control and change management applies as always once the product has been moved to implementation. But in this scenario, we encourage the stakeholder in question, so it might be the sponsor or the healthcare provider, for example, to develop a collaborative relationship with the technology developer and open up that communication channel so that there is a way of providing feedback back to the developer. And they can then use that information about real world implementation to make improvements to the next version of the software, the hardware, whatever it is, so that over time, each generation of the product ideally becomes more and more optimized for usability. So let's now zoom out to the big picture of v3+. So the original v3 framework has been described in the literature as well as in various presentations as modular, meaning that the changes that are limited to one component don't necessarily always require collection of new evidence within the other components. So 3 other components in this case now. Any changes to the use specification, so that is the user groups, the use environments, and the user interface, that is what will prompt the need to either repeat usability validation if needed, or compile documentation that demonstrates that the existing usability data is generalizable to the latest version of the use spec. But expansion to a new population, just for example, that might prompt the need not only to look at the need for more usability validation evidence, but also analytical validation evidence and clinical validation evidence. And in many cases, it might be possible to incorporate multiple objectives into a single study. So analytical and usability validation within, different objectives within the same study, for example. So when we describe v3+ as modular, it means that each component can be considered somewhat independently. But of course, there is always a domino effect when we are thinking about the product and the evidence for it holistically. Now, of course, v3+, as always, is just the beginning of a much more comprehensive evaluation to determine whether a particular technology is fit for purpose. So that might also include consideration of things like security, data rights and governance, and economic feasibility as well. So I've given you a bit of a whirlwind tour of v3+ in a very short time. I promise I'm going to draw breath soon. But comprehensively, we have developed this series of recommendations for best practices. And to support implementation of those practices, we've also developed a series of resources which are available online. And I certainly encourage you all to take a look when you're able to, as you learn more about the framework and you begin to implement it into your own work. We have several case studies available online, submitted by the organizations you see there, some of our project partners. And we also have several also under development. So those will be added in coming weeks and months, as always, in our Resources in Action Hub. And finally, I mentioned earlier that we've been very intentional about the language we have used throughout not only everything that I've presented today and what's online, but also in the manuscripts. So on our resources page, you'll also find a glossary of terms. Okay, so that's the end of my V3 Plus tour. I hope that was helpful to kind of orient you to the information. I'm now going to hand over to some of my colleagues for a panel discussion. So a very warm welcome to three of our project collaborators, Brian Cobb from Genentech, Stefan Matola from SysNav, Oana Porn from Ardex Group, and my colleague, Ben Vandendries, who participated in the project throughout and who will be moderating today's panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessie, for that great summary of the resource. Thank you too, Oana, Brian, Stefan, for your time to be here on the panel today, and of course for the time you invested in the project and all the resources that came out of it, together with all the other partners and collaborators. I know you're all excited about the results of the framework and where it can go from here, especially. And we discussed up front that we were not going to do formal separate introductions in the interest of time, so that we can focus on what really matters. And considering that we have, with the three of you on the call, very diverse perspectives, going from pharma to medical wearable developer to medication adherence solutions, to really leverage those diverse perspectives, I would like to ask you all the same question and answer it as you see fit, which is that if you could go back in time to a moment where you were developing sensor-based digital health technology, or you were using an SDHT, and imagine that you had the extended V3 Plus framework available at the time, how would that have helped you in that moment with regard to the usability validation, really from your perspective? And I would like to start with Oana from the Ardex Group, and your perspective coming from all of the tools that you're developing on your end.
Hello, everyone. So thanks a lot. From our perspective, I would say this framework really brings very clear guidance on steps that the manufacturer should go through. So for example, starting with the complexity of healthcare environment, it's very important to know that each user group may have different needs and expectations, and usability validation can gather insight into the specific needs and preferences of different user groups in order to design the technology and to meet the varied requirements of the healthcare ecosystem. Another one, I think maybe it would be the most important for our type of products. It would be the interoperability and integration, because for our products, it's a combination and an ecosystem of different participants. So the challenge, this is a challenge, and the usability validation that can benefit from the framework is the fact that we can test also the data exchange and the integration, so manufacturers can validate the technology interfaces, that they interface effectively with other systems and devices to have a cohesive user experience. So this would be another part, and of course many other topics like training and adoption and so on. And what I find really useful in this guidance is the fact that it brings really clear examples. So there are also tables showing really clearly what do you have to follow. For example, there's a table with formative evaluation versus summative evaluation. So it's very easy to have clear examples on what you have to do, rather than going and searching different type of studies. So this is my point of view.
All right. Thank you so much, Joanna, for that. And then maybe to switch gears to the pharma perspective, we have Brian Kopp here from Genentech. Would you, again, same idea, same principle, where could this have helped you in the past, knowing what the resource is right now?
Yeah, sure. This is a really important question. And we're also thinking, where can this help us in the future? So I'll layer that in as well. So I want to first just say that considering the end user and their experience interacting with sensor-based digital health tools is really a critical success factor, I believe, if you're going to employ these novel measures into clinical trials. So we're thinking a lot about this. And it's also important to think not even just the trial, but what's the impact also as you think of advancing it into clinical practice? Because you don't want to just have measures that are isolated in clinical trials that can't be leveraged once you launch your new therapy. So now, how does the extension to the V3 framework help us? I think that it really helps us structure our approach. I mean, the tools and resources that are baked into the paper and what Jesse presented, I mean, I would start with just the definitions alone. I mean, we need to use a common language as we talk about this space. It also outlines the key activities to perform. And I mean, it's really important when you're trying to do many types of verification validation studies to make sure you're covering your bases and to make sure you're thinking about those human factors considerations is new to many people in industry. And so as you can start applying and relating it to existing frameworks, it's extremely helpful. And I'll give you a quick example. Imagine you're testing a new digital health tool that has never been used, and you're applying this new type of measure, capability, whatever it is. You can verify the performance, and I think a lot of people are comfortable doing that of the sensor itself and the measure. And you can also validate it in terms of the performance analytically and clinically, but you still won't know, how does that fit into the patient journey? How does that fit into the clinical trial design and the overall clinical workflow? And so things that I start thinking about are the patients able to, and will they use the solution in the right way to be able to generate the measure and the data that you need? And then does the result provide clinicians with what they need in the way they need it to be able to make the clinical decision? And these are, and I can give you lots of examples of where we've ran into big headaches and even failures associated with this whole space. And then maybe two other areas that sorry, go ahead.
Right, yeah, sorry to jump in. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but would you be willing to share one of those failures? Because that's often something that's not done. Sure.
So we were working in a partnership where we did a simulation. This is a formative evaluation. And we thought we had, with lots of rigor, designed this application and tool, which basically pulled electronic health record data into a clinical virtual assistant we called a chatbot that was enabling the clinical care team to get information about a patient on demand. And when we went to actually test it in the simulation, we kind of stumbled upon these challenges with just simple usability and workflow issues that caused us to completely rethink our design. And so fortunately, we were set up for quick iterations so we could successfully pass the formative evaluation. But we learned along the way that there are complexities in those interactions between the providers and the nurses and the staff that precluded our design, or made our design not actually function in the way that we intended. And it required a much more expensive and costly adaptation that was really important. So, and I think that's a really important point, is that in the long scheme, if we don't successfully think through and validate our usability as part of this process, it's going to end up, for our drug trials in particular, being much more costly and much more time consuming, because maybe they won't wear the sensor appropriately, because if they're a patient and they have a disability, maybe it's uncomfortable, or maybe it's too burdensome for them. And so these are the kinds of things that we're experiencing along the way.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And I didn't mean to cut you off. If you wanted to make an additional point, please do.
I mean, the other point is, like, we're all learning. And so the more that we actively publish negative findings and data, which we didn't in the example that we shared with you, but that we ought to, the more other people can learn. So I think there's a learning cycle that is incredibly helpful. So we can use V3 and the extension with usability validation data to help us structure and think through it all. But a great output of us being more consistent and standardized in the approaches would be, now we have to start publishing what are our learnings, what worked, what didn't work, how can we make improvements, what additional extensions might be necessary. And then finally, the last piece is just, how can we be more consistent in our approach with regulatory submissions? I mean, there's like hundreds of questions we could probably be discussing in a meeting like this. And maybe this expanded framework might actually remove some of the uncertainty that, you know, a given pharma company or group or team might be having when it comes to the appropriate regulatory pathway. So there's some great resources in the paper as well.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Brian. And the way you started, I couldn't agree more with the importance of having the perspective that what is used or what is developed for clinical research and clinical trials should at some point make it into clinical care. Not by rule, not by definition, there are exceptions, but in many cases it is often considered way too late in the process indeed. Moving on to Stefan from CISNAV, please, same question for you. You know, looking back or looking forward, you can choose. Where would you believe these resources could have had a very large impact on work that you've done yourself at over at CISNAV?
Well, thank you very much, Ben, for this question. Thank you again to Jesse and the whole DIME team for directing this work, which is really helpful. So back then, back at the time when CISNAV was developing its first generation of sensors, CISNAV was a rather small company. So it was a big decision to take the high road and to invest the resources to include usability studies in our development process. So we had a lot to learn. We had to do it quick, and we had to understand how we could really do properly what we wanted to achieve. So I guess if we had the V3 Plus framework available back then, it would have accelerated our decision to invest resources on usability studies, and also it would have accelerated our learning process for usability testing. So at the time we decided, I mean, we were confident that we wanted to do this. However, we were not super confident in our internal capacity to conduct this usability study. So external suppliers supported us to do this. So we get to learn from them. But now as CISNAV, as a company has grown, one challenge we are undertaking is to develop our internal know-how for designing and conducting usability studies to match industry standards. So back then it would have helped us accelerate it, but today it is in fact helping us to internalize the specific know-how with confidence.
All right, thank you so much. And yeah, I also from personal experience working with devices and developing devices, I know that everybody's pushing companies large and small to talk about user-centered design, and it's easy to talk about it, but actually doing it requires, like you pointed out, conscious effort, and it requires a structured approach, right? And so the V3 Plus framework is really a resource that's trying to accomplish that. So moving forward, hopefully, you know, next time we have a call like that, there will be a company who is in an earlier stage than CISNAV is right now, and can comment on the fact that right out the door, this helped them set that up and pay more attention to it. We have a couple of minutes left, maybe as more of a forward-looking statement. So you all kind of alluded to the fact that we have the resources now. They're out there on the website. The paper, the preprint is out. The paper hopefully soon too. But where do we go from here? Right, like having the resources, having the common language is a critical component. You can't go anywhere without setting that base first. Now that we've set that base, also kind of borrowing from what happened with the V3 original framework when it was published in 2020, which has since been picked up in not only scientific literature, but many, many use cases, some of which are also on the DIME website. Thinking about that aspect and what you would like to see over the next few months and years of where the V3 Plus framework can go and what it would need to, how we would need to make sure that it's set up for success, continued success and growth, right? Well, Stefan, let's do it the other way around and start with you now, if you don't mind. Do you have any comments or thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think the key to, well, in my understanding, one of the big learning from the V3 Plus framework is that you need to work with your users. So you need to be close to your patients, you need to be close to your medical staffs, and you can't be just, designing well-thought devices and, be really, really overconfident that it will work, because it might not. So to me, really the implementation phase will be for us as digital community to make sure that we leave enough, we include enough our patients in all our development. And I guess that as we now have, the same language, if we align the right people, I think we can continue to do great things together.
All right, thank you. Brian, Oana, do you have any more comments on that note?
Maybe me just a short addition, because you asked what do we foresee from now. I think what it would be good is, as Brian mentioned, I think it would be helpful for everyone to have as diverse case studies as possible, probably better described, because from a guidance to real world situations and different type of technologies, it's quite a distance. So I think this would be helpful to have as many case studies as possible documented in different type of combinations, ecosystems, integrations, and to see exactly what are we missing, because every time when a system is more complex, or I don't know, it's not that easy to theorize, we will see some gaps missing, or we will have some questions or some examples of errors. That's what I was saying related to Brian's comment. Mm-hmm. So real world experience, I think that's really useful when thinking about implementation. Absolutely. And make it as efficient as possible.
All right, Brian, any last notes to round us out?
Yeah, I would just add a brief comment. Jesse described this extensive number of a variety of different types of expertise that has weighed in, but I'm really interested to hear how the clinical and scientific community at large views this extension. And then I agree, like use cases and application, real world experiences are really important. And I mentioned publications, can't stress that enough. Like, what are we learning that works and doesn't work? And hopefully this paper will be widely referenced like other papers that DIME has contributed. And then finally, I really hope that we discuss this more and this becomes more of a topic in the appropriate conferences, so that, and maybe with DIME in a leadership position to pose this, so that we can hear what other people are learning along the way more in real time. And then the very last component to me that's really important is this regulatory agency expertise. How are they aligned? How are they connected? Which we're looking forward to hearing more about, of course.
All right, we're taking notes. That's all the time we've got. Thank you all so much.
Brian, what an amazing setup. It's almost like you knew the agenda. Brian, Stefan, Oana, and Ben, thank you all so much for those insights, as well as your work throughout the entire project. I'd now like to introduce Kim Conson, who joins us from FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health, and Beth Konkowski, who joins us from FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, as well as my colleague, Jennifer Goldsack, to share some regulatory perspectives.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jessie. Hi, everyone. My name is Jen Goldsack. I'm the CEO here at the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME. And today is a really special day for us. The V3 framework is one of the first resources we actually launched here at the Digital Medicine Society. And it's fantastic to see how that's essentially emerged as an industry standard for evaluating the performance of sensor-based digital health technologies. That has been buoyed by tremendous guidance, Beth, that I know that you were instrumental to sort of driving out of FDA. And also, what a wonderful point of evolution in our field of digital health measurement, that we are at the point where we have to go beyond the simple question of, does this tool perform sufficiently well? We actually need to think deeply about ensuring that these tools are usable by all of the individuals who could benefit, that we are at a point of wanting to take these tools to scale. We are at a point of wanting to depend on them in clinical research and in patient care, and that we actually want to depend on them for some sort of really high-risk questions, perhaps even some predictions around the onset of cytokine release syndrome, which is another project we're working on here at DataCC. If we are going to depend on these tools to deliver that information, we need to know that they are suitable for use by all of the individuals that we are rolling them out to help. Otherwise, there are inherent risks. This framework is absolutely tremendous. And Beth, I'm going to come to you first to ask you to introduce yourself, and then perhaps tell us a little bit about the brilliant section on usability in the recent DHT guidance that was finalized just in December. I'm really proud about how these new resources sort of support the implementation of some of those guidelines in the guidance. Tell us a bit about why it was so important to include those in the recent guidance and how you came to articulating those practices.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. Yes, we were able to finalize our guidance on digital health technologies and remote data acquisition and clinical investigations at the end of last year. In 2021, we had released a draft, and there had been an open docket for us to receive comments, and the usability verification validation was probably the biggest section that we received comments on, but they were actually all really helpful comments, and I really do think the usability section in particular, we listened to those comments, we reframed it, we no longer call them studies, we call them evaluations, because we recognize there are many different ways to look at usability, to assess it, to make sure that you are collecting the data successfully so that your trial can be a success. We really emphasize the importance of leveraging existing work. There is a lot of work that has already been done when you come talk to us, and that can carry a lot of weight in advancing your clinical trial. Another section that we added in there is really to tailor your evaluation towards the risks and complexities associated with your digital health technology, which is really use a risk-based approach. What makes sense? And it's really driving the success of ensuring that you get the data you need for your study. Our conclusions really didn't change. It's this is an important step to improve the design and function of your technology, to make sure that patients know how to use it, and then really how that drives the instructions for use and training associated with your trial. So we're really excited that the guidance is out and that how nicely it aligns with this effort through DIME, and I'm happy to have been a part of both of them.
Beth, we are incredibly grateful for your leadership in sort of co-creating with your colleagues, I think, such an important guidance document, but also being part of this project team. Appreciate your sort of partnership as always. And, you know, in your remarks, a couple of things jumped out. You mentioned sort of success multiple times, and I think that's what's really nice about the guidance document. It's so nicely positioned in order to put sensor-based digital health technology developers in a position where they can be successful, and more importantly, those investigators who want to select them to position them for success when they deploy these tools. I also really appreciate and want to sort of commend your efforts. The way that you were describing, look, there's a lot of different ways, and we need to be fit for purpose in how we demonstrate sort of usability validation that has been completed in a way that's acceptable. And hopefully the DIME resources can support those folks who perhaps aren't as familiar yet with this part of the evaluation process, that there are lots of options and now resources and education to be able to help people, again, be successful, which is our theme of the day. Kim, I'm going to come to you again. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. And the reason that I look like I'm in an interrogation room somewhere is I'm actually at the Vive conference, and I stepped out from, it's early here on the West Coast. I stepped out of a closed door healthcare executive roundtable, and it was a pretty punchy conversation about how challenging these tools are sometimes to deploy in clinical workflows, but actually that the patient-facing pieces around these technologies has improved. Obviously, the guidance that Beth was just talking about was relying upon sense-based digital health technologies in sort of medical product development, but they're also becoming a routine part of patient care. How does the agency think about how we sort of promote usability in a sort of healthcare practice as well as in clinical research?
Yeah, well, I'm Kim Conson. I'm a biomedical engineer within our Center for Devices and Radiological Health. When we're talking about the development of these technologies, both in a clinical space and to be used in clinical trials, but also in healthcare, you're kind of applying those same principles of usability that are very much outlined in the V3 framework, those that are suggested in the digital health clinical trial guidance that Beth was integral in helping develop. And you can still take those, even though they're geared towards clinical trial, and apply some of those principles to things that are going into the healthcare. One of the things that you really need to consider first off is who's going to be using it. And even just as importantly, who will not be using it in a healthcare setting versus a clinical trial setting. So we can think about researchers being a very integral part of a clinical trial, and their expertise and interpretation of data that are coming out of these sensor-based digital health technologies won't be there in a healthcare setting. So I think it kind of loops into the design of these systems, looping in the extra information that's needed for people to properly use them and also properly interpret the information that's coming off of them and take clinically relevant action based on those results, if that's part of the context of use.
I want to underscore, Kim, sort of one of your remarks there that I think is really, really important, which is not just who will be using this, but who won't be. And I think one of the sort of superpowers of sensor-based digital health technologies is that they can be used outside of the walls of the clinic, that we can capture this data that we've not been able to access before, do it with resolution that's been beyond the reach of traditional assessments, but we have to actually position the sort of patients and the participants for success, right? And what does that look like? How do we contemplate all of those pieces? What does that oversight look like? What does that support look like? I think that's such a brilliant call out, and something that we all need to keep front of mind, and certainly something that's underscored in the new resources that came out today.
Yeah.
I hope everyone has realized that I'm really excited about where we are today. I do think that this is a really important moment in sort of the evolution of the field. And I think it's also a sort of a powerful moment because some really important advancements have happened together. I think we've seen, remote patient monitoring and sort of remote therapeutic monitoring codes really evolve such that there are the necessary sort of reimbursement pathways for us to use these tools in healthcare. And we're starting to see them come mainstream. On the clinical research side of the house, the guidance clarifies so much and just adds confidence. And then today, with the launch of open access resources, and then for folks who need a little bit more help, the education materials as well. I really, Beth, I'm going to come back to your language because I think you've sort of summed it all up. We really, I think, are at a moment of positioning the field, whether that's product developers, care providers, researchers, and of course, patients themselves, for success in the digital era. And it's an exciting time. Beth, I'm going to come to you, and then Kim, just to get your quick sort of gestalt on where we are in the evolution of sort of remote patient monitoring before handing it back to Jessie.
Thank you, Jen. You summarized that very nicely. I really think it's wonderful to see a culmination of so many different stakeholders coming together to work on such an effort. And I think DIME has really laid out a nice platform to ensure that usability is a part of the verification and validation process to set us up for success.
Terrific. Kim, go ahead.
Yeah, I echo everything that Beth and you said, Jen. And I also say that we have some regulatory science efforts that will continue to build on the resources that are out there that are coming out of CDRH, that are coming out of CEDAR, that can facilitate the evaluation and the design and development of some of these sensor-based digital health technologies.
Terrific. Well, thank you both for being with us today. Thank you for your contributions to this work, your leadership at the agency, the sort of spirit of collaboration that we just see as being sort of an absolute core component of sort of digital regulatory sort of science and strategy at FDA. Jessie, I also want to thank you for your leadership on this project as I hand it back, and also every member of the project team and our education team for sort of bringing everything to the fore today. Let me give it back to you to close us out.
Thank you so much, Kim, Beth, and Jen, for taking the time to join us for the fascinating discussion, and to our panelists as well. So we are almost at time for today's event, but we've already covered a lot of ground. I do have another exciting announcement to share. DIME's Digital Medicine Academy has developed a crash course on building fit-for-purpose sensor-based digital health technologies. This course, which is now available online, focuses on all 4 components of V3+. So it includes the latest usability validation component, as you've just learned about today. So my colleagues within the Digital Medicine Academy, and really all of us here at DIME, are thrilled to offer this course at no charge to everyone who's joined us today. So please do use the QR code here. I believe if it's not already there, we'll soon have a link in the chat that will take you immediately to the page with the discount code applied. Thank you very much for joining us. I so look forward to engaging with you all on Slack, email, whatever way you would like to chat with us here at DIME. I'd love to hear your thoughts, capture your case studies in our Resources in Action Hub, as always. To close us out, please do join us for our next event on March 27th, which is our virtual journal club defining the dimensions of diversity to promote inclusion in the digital era of healthcare. And our upcoming Physical Activity Industry Day, that one is planned for a Wednesday, April 10th. Thank you again to the entire project team, to all of our panelists, to Beth and Kim for joining us from FDA. Have a great day and take care. Thank you.